Okay, good morning, everybody, on this beautiful, or at least beautiful where I am, Saturday morning, the 16th of November. I decided to do a live because this video, unlike many of my others, most of my others, will be informal, quite eclectic, and not as well structured as the videos I make for the official series, like the one I'm doing now on Yahweh. What I want to do in this video is take you through this journey I've been on. And it's also kind of to help me take inventory of where I'm at up to this point and how I got here, and sort of evaluate maybe where I should go from here. And by the way, I will go ahead and make this more conversational. And if we get anybody joining here who wants to, well, nobody's in here right now, so I'm not gonna, no need to say it, since you're not gonna know until after it's recorded. I'll wait till someone gets in and then I'll make the announcement. But I have looked painstakingly at a lot of different esoteric and occult traditions of late. And while I am interested in things like magic, astrology, and things of that nature, quite deeply, actually, and would also like to get into it more, as far as not just studying it and understanding it intellectually, but also practicing, I have found that it is most important to know where you stand metaphysically and philosophically before launching into a lifestyle where, you don't want to just willy-nilly go about practicing occult things or esoteric things, not knowing what you're doing or why you're doing it, or who you may be evoking by doing it. And so I have spent a great deal of time knowing where I stand metaphysically, knowing where I stand philosophically, and knowing where I stand ethically. And then once I do that, I start looking very closely at the theogonies, which are accounts related to the origin and descent of the gods and goddesses, or angels and demons, depending on what tradition you're coming from. Excuse me. Once you get a grasp on the theogonies, on the pantheons, and on the mythologies surrounding, the mythologies and stories surrounding the theogonies, it becomes possible to structure your lifestyle in a way that's a little bit more comfortable for you, as far as knowing who you're comfortable evoking or invoking, and what you're willing to do or practice, what influences you're willing to bring into your life or not. And so as I said at the beginning, this is going to be a very eclectic video. I'm going to be kind of all over the place, but I will try to structure it to the best of my ability in this conversational format. And also, since I have some people here, I want to go ahead and say that at the end of this, or close to the end of this, I am willing to respond to questions and statements that are coming in. So you can leave questions. I may or may not be able to get to all of them, depending on how long this gets, but you are welcome to do that. And if you want to join the channel and you've asked a particularly pertinent question, if you want to subscribe, I would be willing to take some of those questions and format them as future videos and address them in the comments under my videos. So basically, as I said, I came from a Christian background. I was born and raised in a Protestant home, fundamentalist Protestant home. I remained in that environment until the age of 27. 4 years after I got married, I'm remarried now, but 4 years after my first marriage, we briefly entered an Anglican church. I wanted something more high church, something liturgical, something with more authority. I wanted apostolic authority. I wanted creeds and councils and that kind of thing. But I wasn't intrepid enough at that point to go whole hog and enter like the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, which looks a lot like the Roman Catholic Church, right? Although, even though the trappings are very similar, there's a lot of differences, a lot of very deep doctrinal differences, although some of them aren't quite as significant as I would have thought at the time, right? So I became Eastern Orthodox eventually after 18 months within the Anglican Church, and spent a lot of time there. Actually, I spent 15 years marinating in that, understanding. Somebody's saying I don't believe in God. Well, that's not true. I do. I just don't believe in a God that maybe you believe in. That doesn't mean I don't believe in God. So anyway, I got to the point where I began to grasp some very, very difficult metaphysical concepts that may be hard to comprehend for most people who aren't accustomed to thinking on a deeper metaphysical and philosophical level. But once you grasp the nature of the issues and where the evidence is going, and you're able to articulate that for yourself and for others, which is why I came out here, put myself out here, created this channel, and made a whole series of videos critiquing the Holy Trinity. Once it becomes apparent, like at the deepest level, there's no going back. I mean, I have no doubt that I made the right decision. Right now, I'm trying to figure out who is who, right, within the realm of Dharma, more broadly speaking, within the realm of Dharma or paganism or the esoteric and the mystical in general. So, but what I had to do for myself was I had to know. I couldn't just, I'm not like a lot of people, right? A lot of Christians who leave the Christian faith, and that goes for Muslims, Jews, people of really any religious background. Most people who leave where they're at either have a very, very superficial acquaintance with their faith, never really read the books, right? Never really engaged with their saints, never really had a prayer life, never had they were never devoted to the calendar or the yearly life cycle of the faith that they belong to. I did all of those things. I believed in going to church every Sunday. As an Orthodox Christian, I attended most of the services during the week when I could. I even had a spiritual father who directed me for years, guided me for years, within the sacred mystical practice in an Eastern context of hesychasm, which is the Jesus prayer, if you've ever heard of that. And you actually do breathing exercises. You're saying the Jesus prayer, you're breathing in the first part of it and then breathing out with the last part of it. And I did see changes in my life. I was moving in a good direction. I did feel that my relationship with God was becoming gradually more intimate on a mystical level, inwardly, right? That caused me to discover the fact that, as I looked at, to make a long story short, I read towards the tail end of my Christian experience, for the second time, I read a very thin booklet called the Bhagavad Gita, which is very famous within the Hindu tradition. And in many ways, it read a lot like the long series of multi-volume series of books in the Eastern Christian tradition called the Philokalia or Philokalia, depending on your pronunciation. So, which means, I can't remember what Kalia means now, but Philo, love. Um, and the saints there were describing their mystical experiences, right? They were describing warmth inwardly. They were describing light. They were describing, um, a transformation from a more ego-centered life to a more humble state of existence, to a more humble lifestyle. They got to the point where they were more open towards other people. They were able to love others more, and they were to love their enemies, I think, more readily than the average person who isn't practicing these, isn't practicing mystical contemplation. But in rereading the Bhagavad Gita and then branching out a little bit more by looking at the Upanishads and some other texts, I came to find that these traditions also had wise men, saints, wise men and women, saints, sages, gurus, whatever you want to call them, elders, who were experiencing literally all of the same things that I just described. The same phenomena was occurring, the absolute same phenomena. These are what Christians would call the fruits of the Spirit. And this is happening across, the gamut, from Taoism to Hinduism to Buddhism to, Sikhism and Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Within those latter three traditions, because they are not particularly esoteric, because they don't specifically revolve around mysticism, they revolve more around doctrine and dogma, it's harder to find that esoteric tradition within those faith communities, but they are there. Okay, they are there. They do exist. In some of the Far Eastern traditions I recounted, that is more of a focus. Okay, but while they have that advantage, there's also some other things that I'm going to be touching on in this video. They have a deeper and wider connection to the occult. So it's not just a matter of relating directly with the Supreme Being for the purpose of acquiring divine union. They have a more holistic approach to life, to reality, to the cosmos, the universe. They see all of it as being divine, connected to the divine being very intimately. It is really just a manifestation of what is in God's mind. It's the divine world, right? This infinite world that exists in the mind of God that is made manifest and that flowers and that incarnates in this manifest existence, in this realm, in this cosmos of ours. So as a result, there is more discussion and more practice surrounding things having to do with communication with angels and demons, which the demonic is very real in those traditions, but it's understood differently than it is in Christianity, which I will also touch on throughout the course of this video. But angels and demons, gods and goddesses, who are lesser entities, right? They come to them, they respect them, they honor them, they even go to them asking for favors, for boons, for powers sometimes, or just for let's say money if you're struggling financially. There's a lot of things that you can interact with the deities for, a lot of purposes, so but as I said, okay, well, also, yeah, let me go a little bit further. So there's that, but there are also nature spirits, right? They believe that everything is infused with divine life. Everything from the rocks and the trees to the mountains to the planets and the galaxies is all enlivened by the Spirit of God. It's all animated by the divine soul, right? And so there's this almost pantheistic understanding that creation is just filled with aliveness, with that it is, in a sense, organically living. But beings at the same time, from the mineral to the vegetable to the animal to the human, have, possess different levels or different gradations or degrees of consciousness, so that it's not like the life of an ant has the same value as the life of a human being, even if you do see some radical left-wing people abusing that concept, right? So where you even get people who want to justify getting an abortion, late-term abortion, while bemoaning the fact that whales are being killed off the coast of Florida or something. That's just absurd, obscene, really. But that is an aberration, by the way. So yes, and then so what we want to, now that I'm at the point where I know what I don't believe, and to a great extent I do know what I do believe, right? I have put myself out there on the internet, here on YouTube, as a non-dualist, and I am a non-dualist, and I've gone out of my way to explain what that entails in different areas. What does that mean for ethics? What does that mean for metaphysics and philosophy? What does that mean, for what does it mean for science? That I haven't discussed science as much, but it has implications for quantum physics and biology and lots of things. But what this does is it makes you think a lot more. It's a little more complicated now, right? Because if you no longer have this sharp dualistic sort of really Manichaean outlook on good and evil, where there's absolute good and there's absolute evil, and for example, the demons, for most Christians, right, are totally severed from God. There's no grace there anymore. Once they have fallen, there's no coming back. They are irredeemable. They are irreparable. There's no good in them whatsoever. That is not true for a non-dualist, because we are all intimately connected to the being of God from the very beginning. We are, in fact, co-eternal with him. Okay, we are not co-eternal in the sense that the Spirit and the Son are co-eternal in the Holy Trinity within the doctrine of Christianity, in the sense that we don't exist in some separate bubble, separate from creation. Okay, we all, however, are emanations of and productions within the mind of God from all eternity. So we are caused, but we are not identical, therefore, with the Supreme Being, but we are of his being, and therefore co-eternal with him at an individual level. So there's that. What that does in terms of our understanding, it gives us a far more nuanced perspective on what good and evil are. Good and evil exist along a very, very wide spectrum. So that means there's not absolute good, there's not absolute perfection, and then absolute evil, to where we are totally separated from God and require some outside intervention, such as a human sacrifice, to be rejoined or reconnected or reunited with God. We exist in various states of closeness or distance from the divine. And we all exist along this scale. And so when you find within the world of the occult or the world of the esoteric, is you find certain groups that are practicing things, doing things, believing things that are very, that seem very distasteful, very harmful, and that's true. There's a lot of that going on. Harmful to oneself, harmful to other people, harmful to society at large. You have people who are kind of in the middle, who have a more kind of balanced approach. Then you've got people who are so far on the right, speaking of the right here, using it in more political terms to mean more, let's say, conservative, who want to just live in pure light. The problem with that is when you do that, you actually fall into evil. Okay, so if you're too far in the dark or too far in the light, to the point where you are not integrating both, then that both of those stances, both of those positions, actually lead to great damage and great harm and great evil, because if you are so deeply embedded in the quote unquote light that those outside of that bubble are demonized and deemed to be not just less than you, but maybe completely severed from the grace of God, that has horrible implications. And it's why institutions like the Roman Catholic Church back in the 12th century, 13th century, could literally wipe out an entire generation or two of people such as the Cathars in southern France, who didn't think exactly like the Nicene tradition of Christianity. They didn't think exactly like the Nicene Christians or the Roman Catholic Church. They didn't think like the pontiff. And so they believed things that were considered dangerous because they did not measure up to the dogmatic principles of the church. And as a result, the church found it expedient to suddenly justify very Old Testament style behaviors such as genocide. And so they went through and just wiped out an entire people, over 1 million people, men, women, children, infants, it didn't matter. They wiped them all out. So, and so it may sound scary, right, when I say you've got to integrate the dark and the light. But I'm not speaking like a Manichaean. I'm not speaking of darkness as intrinsically evil, and I'm not speaking of the light as something that has no that is so isolated from this other aspect of reality that we treat this other aspect like so poorly, right, that we end up becoming the evil ones by committing the evil acts, right? So there is an integration that allows us to be more integrated in our individual beings, and then hopefully by extension, if enough people are doing that, that allows us to bring a more harmonious model of life to the world, whether it be in the realm of politics, economics, medicine, psychology, whatever, right? You name it. Geopolitics, warfare, that sort of thing. There's got to be a better way. So once we understand how good and evil actually works, and let me say one more thing about that before moving forward. I had a video or two on this, but I think it's worth talking about for a moment here before we move forward. The problem with the way good and evil is understood within the Christian tradition is that you have this being who, even though Christians don't explicitly argue that he is an anthropomorphic being, he acts like an anthropomorphic being. He is more or less anthropomorphic in terms of his place in the system, in terms of how good and evil are viewed within the system by Christian theologians. So what I mean by that is this. Because Christians measure good and evil by whether or not we attain to a standard of obedience to a law or law system given by the being Yahweh, right? Because that's how it's measured. Since it's measured legally rather than more organically, right? That puts us in a very unenviable spot, because when you start looking at very uncomfortable things in the Old Testament where God is commanding his people to do terrible things to other people, from charging interest and practicing usury to the foreigner, not to the fellow Jew or to the resident alien, chattel slavery, genocide, even in some instances human sacrifice, which I'm going to be covering in the series I'm working on now. That puts you in the position of having to say that the good is really whatever God decides to do in the moment. So he's very capricious in that sense. Even if you grant the Christian that the Christian God mostly acts in a certain way, or prefers to mostly act in a certain way, now you have to give ground for the idea that, well, there are circumstances, there are situations where God does things that look pretty bad, but he must know better because he's God, right? But then that becomes very difficult to justify philosophically. And plus it flies in the face of the New Testament standard of loving one's neighbor. The standard of loving one's neighbor in the Old Testament is very different from the one that we see in the New Testament, which I just covered recently in a video. So you either have that assessment to make, where you're forced, really, if you're consistent, to say that God, well, you know, sometimes God does these things, which means, but then that's opening up the Pandora's box, right? Because if he can do this, well, he can do anything, and it would be good simply because he commanded it, right? And he must have some, well, his ways are higher than our ways, right? So he must have some good reason. Even if we don't understand it, he may have some great reason why he came down suddenly in 2024, November 2024, and told me to go rape some lady walking down the street. Well, that seems awfully horrible, but he has that right, apparently, on that logic. Now, if we say, if we want to imply or take the position that there is some higher standard that God himself is somehow subject to, and that he would never, ever deviate from this standard, well, clearly, whatever that standard is allows him to do pretty much anything he wants. If there's a higher standard than that, well, okay, which by the way relativizes good and evil, because now there's no way to even distinguish between good and evil. But if we want to say that he is subject to some higher standard, well, now he's no longer the Most High God. He's no longer the true God. He's some lesser entity, right? Who just rules by might makes right, or whatever. He just happens to have the biggest stick, the biggest club. So it's this that position in theology, by the way, is called more divine command theory, where you either have to take the view that God is subject to a higher law, in which case he's no longer the Most High God, or pretty much whatever he does goes because his ways are higher than our ways and we'll just never comprehend it, which leads to a very subjective approach to ethics and relativism, ultimately. In the non-dual view, we don't have that difficulty. We don't have that cognitive dissonance going on, because there is a way to relate to people and to the world around us that is consistent with the metaphysics of non-dual philosophy. These ethics are more organic because they just flow from the metaphysical. They just flow from the metaphysics. They flow from the principles themselves. They don't require some being to come down with a law, right, to reveal something that we didn't have before. They are organically revealed within our own experience, within this life. So with that said, now we have a framework, we have a better foundation upon which to understand the esoteric, to understand specifically the occult, and why there is so much gray area involved. One of the reasons there's so much gray area is that demons are not what we thought they were, right? Demons are not these irreparably damaged, irredeemable beings who have fallen so far from grace that the fact that they even exist is just because, for whatever reason, God wants to keep them around, wants to keep them alive, right? Just so he can torture them for all eternity. That's not how that works. The demons are no different from us. The fallen angels are no different from us. They are creatures like we are. They may be different in the sense that maybe they live a lot longer. They may be more powerful. They may live on a different plane than we do. They're interdimensional. They may have abilities we don't have, and so on and so forth, but they are creatures of God, right? And just like us, they live in a higher or lower orientation to God. Every creature in the cosmos exists in some relationship to God. Higher or lower, but never completely separated. And so there's always the inevitability. There's always the eventuality that those beings will repair themselves, that they will see the futility of what they are doing, that they will learn from their experiences, from the suffering that they cause themselves, that there is another way, and they will get back on that path, that trajectory towards union with God. And they will get back on the mystical path, right? Instead of simply trying to manipulate us, instead of trying to deceive us, manipulate us, get something out of us, they will find that better way. But they are capable of good too. And that's completely foreign to the thinking of a Christian who does not believe that they are capable of any good. So when we come to the realm of the occult, right? And by the way, I haven't started practicing. This is something I'm deeply researching. I'm the kind of person that there are some people who just content themselves with mystical contemplation. They don't want to. They may acknowledge even that gods and goddesses exist. They may acknowledge that angels and demons exist, but they're not interested. They want to kind of cut all of that out and just go right to the source, right? And so they just focus on the mystical aspect, which is perfectly good, perfectly fine. And in fact, mysticism is the highest form of spirituality. So they're doing a good thing in that regard. I'm the kind of person that I'm fascinated by every facet of life, right? And I'm the kind of person, I'm very knowledge oriented. I'm a knowledge seeker, and I am a knowledge dispenser. I like to share with people what I know and what I've learned. And I like to experience everything, right? I don't want to do anything that's going to harm myself or other people, but outside of that, I want to experience everything that's possible to experience. I want to know everything that's possible to know. I want to understand every aspect of this life, this existence, and know it intimately. And so I do have a desire to practice magic. I do want to do good things with that magic, right? And some of these powers you can acquire just through mysticism. You don't have to practice magic to do it. You don't have to invoke anything or evoke anything or anything of that nature. But when you get into that realm, so let's talk about that more now. I think we're at the point where we can focus on that a little bit more. When you venture into that realm where there are maybe certain things that you feel you need, or things that you just want, right, that you desire, that you would like to acquire, that you can maybe get in the more immediate term, that doesn't require the hard work of mystical discipline. There are things you can do, and I'm not going to get into great detail on that. There's books you can read, things you can look at. Okay, what we have to talk about for a couple minutes first, all right, is the theogonies and the pantheons, because there's a whole history, there's a whole mythology, and we're never going to be able to go back and reconstruct it and get it all perfect, and we don't have to, okay, because they may be personal beings, which I think they are, but they also represent archetypes. They represent energetic qualities, right? So we don't have to know exactly who was born of who and whose brother and sister was who in the pantheon, and who was the, who was the one who. There may be instances where there's a being that we don't know if he was really good or whether he was really evil, or because there's geopolitical conflict in all of these myths, and there's a lot of gray here. We have the Titans, and we have the Olympians. We have, right, the Titans are the basically they correspond to the Watchers in the Hebrew tradition, the fallen angels. They're the so-called old gods, right? The old ones that are worshipped in a lot of traditional witchcraft, in some Luciferian circles, which I'll touch on more as we go. So, and the Olympians and the Titans are not distinct races. They're not different types of beings. They're the same. They are distinguished mainly, it seems to me, from everything I've looked at, in terms of their political rivalry. But there's cross membership, so to speak, here, because if you look at stories like Prometheus, right? Prometheus cooperates with his brother Zeus, who, according to the writer of Revelation, corresponded to Yahweh in the pantheon, because his place was in Pergamon, according to Revelation 2:13. That's where Satan's throne was, and there was a giant altar to Zeus, dedicated to Zeus, there at that point in history. And there's a whole history of this showing how this connection is made between Yahweh and Baal and Zeus. But these different beings are plugged into different mythologies, so they don't even have exactly the same role in all these different mythologies, depending on what part of the world you're in, because we have to understand history kabbalistically. Most of history, especially ancient history, is the working out of aristocracies, working out of the life of the people, this esoteric knowledge that was carried on by these aristocracies and nobilities. And everybody thought in terms of a right pillar, a left pillar. This is where we get right-hand path and left-hand path terminology in occultism. And then there's the middle pillar, which is supposed to represent harmony or balance. And there are different cults, different esoteric groups that identify more with the right-hand path, more with the left-hand path, more with the middle pillar. And across these different civilizations, the right pillar might be somewhere different than it is in some other part of the world, right? And the left hand might look different somewhere else, and the middle pillar will be here instead of over here. And so we can't just look at the Hebrew pantheon and go, oh, so this is where, so Jesus was Lucifer, and Lucifer is Prometheus, and Prometheus was so-and-so. These are archetypes. They don't fit into the same place in the Greek and Roman as they do in the Sumerian and Egyptian and so on, or in the Hebrew. But there is a continuity in terms of archetype, and in terms of the pillars, and in terms of general energetic qualities. Now, with that said, one of the things I've come across is the fact that I mentioned it a moment ago. One of the things I've come across is the fact, and this is taught like explicitly in traditional witchcraft, for example, and in so-called Luciferian Hermeticism. There's different types of Hermeticisms. A pure, quote-unquote, Luciferian Hermeticism does not equate or identify or conflate Lucifer with, which is not a formal or proper name, by the way, does not equate him with Satan. I have seen Luciferians bemoan the fact. I've read books by Luciferians bemoaning the fact that in modern occultism, most occultists seem not to know that Lucifer is not Satan. So they're making the same mistake that the Christian church makes when they combine the two into one. So there are things that Christians discovered over the centuries in their research of pagan groups, various pagan groups and witchcraft groups, and hermetic groups, that they automatically chalked up to Satanism when in fact it wasn't Satanism. And because they don't believe in a Satan figure the way the church does, and because they don't believe that demons are incapable of any good, or that they are irredeemable, in spite of the mutual acknowledgement that demons exist, there's a very different way of understanding who they are and what they're doing, and what we get from them, and how we are affected by our interaction with them. So there's a lot of nuanced stuff here that has to be taken into account before we simply start talking about wiping people out for being dangerous heathen or whatever, right? Because you're just as bad, if not worse, depending on what time in the history of the Christian church we're talking about. So we are all part of this human experience. We're, from a non-dual perspective, we have all shown ourselves capable of great goodness, and we've shown ourselves capable of monstrosities on both sides. So this is one thing I want to get across, that I want to emphasize and get across in this video. But I also want to, like I said at the very beginning, I want to show you kind of where I'm at now, after I've taken inventory of all these different theogonies, all these different pantheons, all these different mythologies, and then integrating that with the metaphysics of non-dualism, and knowing why I now stand outside the church. And now, in particular, that we're so far into this series on Yahweh, what I have discovered is this. Yahweh, as he is Kabbalistically understood by the Kabbalistic authors of the New Testament, who were part of this very early Jewish Christian Messianic movement that followed Jesus, they saw Yahweh as being too of a right pillar extremist. He represented and embodied harshness, extreme severity. He was a punisher. He was he was kind of a Nazi, to be honest with you, a total fascist, right? I mean, he's starving his own people, he's cursing his own people, he's leaving them to die in the wilderness, and then he's also building a military for 40 years in the wilderness when he could have taken them there. In less than a year, he could have gotten them to the promised land, but he takes 40 years to do it because he wants to build them up into a hardened force that's going to go wipe out his enemies out, within the land of Canaan and even outside the land of Canaan. And there were Jews who were sick and tired of worshiping that entity. So Jesus came along, set himself up as the Messiah, said, I actually came to fulfill some of these prophecies that were given by Yahweh. Those actually refer to me. So he goes and he tries to fulfill some of these prophecies. Or in some cases, the stories are just written by those who supported Jesus, by the New Testament authors. These things didn't necessarily all literally happen. They built up a narrative around Jesus. There's a lot of narrative, a lot of story, a lot of stuff that was built up decades after Jesus' core teachings, such as his teachings and preachings in the Sermon on the Mount and so on, that are designed to tell you that Jesus is actually the one who came to fulfill these expectations, in order to get the attention of the Jews off of Yahweh and onto Jesus. So according to the Kabbalistic authors of the New Testament, Yahweh is a satanic figure, right? Again, Satan in Christianity, or not in esoteric Christianity, but in exoteric Christianity, is really the embodiment, the incarnation of just pure evil. Well, pure evil doesn't exist. So Satan in this context is not quite as menacing and as just all-encompassing, all-enshrouding, as it would be understood in Christianity. But it is a severe lack of integration of the dark and the light. And that's what Yahweh represents. And so they proposed this other hermetic character, Jesus. And they said, you should worship this archetype. This is the archetype, the model we want you to follow. You see the same thing in all the other pantheons where there are wars, conflicts, and there's a changing of the guard politically, not just within the pantheon, but on earth, in these civilizations, in these kingdoms that are superintended and ruled in the interdimensional spaces by these higher ups, by these beings. Call them the Watchers. And different political models are being proposed, and people are usurping roles and changing places and proposing different ethical systems and different political systems. And some are more so extreme left that they become deleterious and harmful, and as we just saw, on the extreme right you get the same thing. So I'm at a point right now where I'm trying to understand how to integrate a pursuit of the occult, or the pursuit of magic, the pursuit of the esoteric, with my overall non-dual philosophy, with my mystical life, and so on, and my ethical commitments. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish this by talking in a little more detail about what I've learned regarding demons. I am not advocating a particular practice. I'm not advocating that you go out and do certain things or not do certain things. I'm giving you just what I think is something very interesting, a far more nuanced perspective on these things that I didn't know as a Christian, right? So the angels in the Hebrew tradition are essentially the gods in other traditions. For whatever reason, the Hebrew pantheon took on an explicitly masculine character, which I guess makes sense because eventually Yahweh was stripped of his relationship with Asherah, with his counterpart. They wanted a male-only deity. In Hebrew Kabbalah, in that tradition, there is this understanding that Shekinah abandoned the temple at one point in the history of Israel, which she would have been the counterpart of Yahweh. She actually represented Asherah. She's also known as Sophia in the deuterocanonical books, or the apocryphal books of the intertestamental period that we find in the Septuagint. And there's the belief that Lilith was this who was demonized in the Hebrew tradition. Lilith became a demoness for the Jews. She, even though she's not this evil entity for a lot of pagans and witches, Lilith has sexual relations with Adam, right? And she is seen as being a corrupter of Adam in this very ancient Gnostic perspective. There's also a teaching that Eve had sexual relations with Samael, who was a fallen angel or a watcher. But what I've learned is that a lot of these Luciferian types, again, they don't equate Lucifer with Satan, have an extremely nuanced perspective, to the point where some of them will even acknowledge that Lucifer descended prematurely, that he had good intentions. He didn't have ill intentions towards us. He actually had good intentions. He wanted to accelerate our evolution. He wanted to accelerate our spirituality. He wanted to accelerate perhaps even our biological evolution, because there's a strong belief in the esoteric world that, and it goes back as far as you can go, really, that we evolve not just spiritually, but we evolve biologically. That he wanted to do this for us, but it was done prematurely. That Adam and Eve were meant to be on a kind of probation. They weren't meant to have a knowledge of good and evil immediately, but they were going to be given a knowledge of good and evil, because again, you have to have the light and the dark. You can't know what the light is without the dark. You can't know what the dark is without the light. And you can't be too far on one side or the other, or you're going to end up in a very bad place, right? So, what was the last thing I just said? Anyway, so the fall. They see the fall as a very well-intentioned event, but that Adam and Eve weren't ready for the knowledge that they have when they acquired it. But because death, things like death and suffering and pain and loss and lack and so on are things that are just part and parcel of being in the manifest world, because nothing can manifest without the basic duality of distinction and separation, being able to discern between different objects and different people and different creatures and different beings. In order to have that duality prevail, to even have this created existence, you have to have the polarity of light and dark, good and bad, masculine and feminine, to make sense of the world, to make sense of anything, to make sense of our very experience. And so they would say it was necessary for Adam and Eve to acquire that knowledge and to even experience what we experience today in terms of the negative, the more negative polarity, in terms of pain and suffering and death. We had to experience that first before we could before we can ascend the ladder, so to speak, mystically, and acquire the fullness of divine union. So what's interesting is that they worship Lucifer as being the primordial light, or the first emanation of the supreme God. He is considered the first emanation. He's even considered the divine spark that exists within us. He's basically the divine self. And then from him, and he's the primary demiurge. In other words, he wasn't. We often think of this demiurgic. When we hear this demiurgic language, we often think that the demiurge is evil. Well, he is for certain groups. He is for certain, for example, early church era Gnostic groups, right? He's considered evil, and he's the architect of this world that we're trapped in, and that the evil archons rule over, and matter itself is evil, and we've got to escape it. That is not what I'm talking about here. This view is a more non-dual view. It doesn't see the material world as evil. It sees Lucifer as the truly what his name is called, the light bearer. He is the primary light. He is the first emanation of God. He is also often called the ruler or the Lord of the first light. Proceeding from him are 7 other emanations, often called the 7 sages, who are the planetary deities, who are linked in this tradition with the so-called watchers or fallen angels. And they suffered for what they did, and they are suffering for what they did. They are often called chthonic deities because they're darker. They are more primitive than the celestial gods and goddesses. They're more primitive, which is important to understand, because when you learn in your research on the occult about activities which involve the invoker offering blood, cutting his own hand and letting blood out into a bowl and offering things like this to whoever, you know that they are invoking a chthonic deity, because chthonic deities actually need things like blood. They actually feed, quote unquote, on the blood and its energy. They feed on sexual fluids, for example. There are people who do this, who in other respects practice a very sophisticated and high-level mystical faith, who are not just interested in these sort of lower entities, but want to ascend and acquire a union, who have a more sophisticated and more nuanced code of ethics, for example. And then there are those who are just way off in left field, who have become so degenerate and so ingrained in certain habits that they really belong to some of the worst of the worst filth on this planet that you can imagine, including a lot of the international and global pedophile rings that we hear about. They're not just engaged in pedophilia, they're engaged in all sorts of sick, twisted nonsense. Because the chthonic deities they are in relationship with exist on a greater closeness or distance from God. And depending on which ones you're interacting with, that's going to influence how you live your life, right? You could live, by the way, a perfectly virtuous life and invoke these entities. There are entities who require, for example, human sacrifice in exchange for some of the magical powers that people want, which I'm obviously not advocating. There are entities who may only require that you cut your hand open and give them some blood, and they'll give you certain things. And as long as you're protecting yourself and you're preparing yourself with the magic circle or the magic triangle, and you're saying the right things, and you're not getting out before certain things have been done, you're going to be fine. You're not going to be harmed. You're not going to be injured. You're not going to be attacked. You're not going to be haunted for the rest of your life. Your house isn't going to become haunted. You know what I'm saying? And you may get what you want, and you're not even worshiping these entities. You're simply binding them to do your will, and that's part of their punishment. That's why there's this whole Solomonic tradition, Hermetic Solomonic tradition about Solomon and the Lesser Key of Solomon, where there's a grimoire called the Lesser Key of Solomon, in which he actually binds the demons to his will and forces them to build the first temple. So one does not need to be a worshiper of chthonic deities to work with chthonic deities. So I'm just giving you this as an example to show that reality is far more nuanced than you thought it was. Unless, of course, you're listening and you're already aware of all this stuff, because some people are. But most people are not interested and don't have the discipline to really go into the weeds on all this stuff. But it really is important, because the details really do make up reality as it is. So there are people who are suffering. There are demons who are suffering. But they are still connected enough with the source of all that is with this, with the source, with their creator, that they will eventually learn their lesson and they will make it back up the ladder. They will be reinstated to their original place, and hopefully, well, eventually they will break free of this cycle of samsara, which is birth, death, and rebirth, and they will live in everlasting bliss, just like the rest of us. There are those who choose to work only with the angels, with the celestials. There are those who will work with both angels and chthonic entities. And as I said, some who work with chthonic entities end up going so far down the path that they end up becoming controlled by them, and doing things with their power that they shouldn't, things that are ethically not just questionable, but just flat out wrong. You know, and what they call the black arts, that's another nuance we need to talk about. The black arts. Not all of the things that we have been told are black or evil are intrinsically evil. They're evil depending on how we acquired those things and what we had to do to acquire that power, and they're evil depending on how we used it. So, for example, necromancy, right? Communicating with the dead. I'm sorry. No, not necromancy. I'm thinking of, there's another word I think I'm thinking of. Is necromancy communication with the dead or something else? I can't recall. I think that's communication with the dead. Depending on what the chthonic being you are invoking is asking of you, you could communicate with the spirits of the dead. You could acquire a power that allows you not only to heal illness, but to exacerbate the illness in somebody else until that person dies, or until it causes very serious damage. Now, if you're using that to defend yourself against attack, and you're using it in the proper measure to send a message or to just protect yourself from attack, you don't want to get into a tit for tat, because that's just going to create issues, and you could end up just putting yourself in more danger. But you may have to use, if you're not a pacifist, you shouldn't have a problem with using methods of violence. If you don't have a problem with using a gun, you shouldn't have a problem using magically acquired means of doing harm, if that is to defend yourself. If you are someone who is prone to bearing a grudge, and you are tempted to use these powers to get revenge, or just out of sheer spite, that's something you wouldn't want to do, or you shouldn't do. So with all of that out of the way, where I'm at right now in terms of the occult aspect of this, now that I understand the Bible Kabbalistically and I read it that way, I understand that Yahweh is this satanic entity, again, Kabbalistically speaking, that occupies an extreme place on the right wing of Kabbalah, and you really wouldn't want to, if you have any interest in balance, you really wouldn't want to emulate or worship or make, model. At the same time, the same writers of the New Testament who rejected Yahweh, they also rejected the Watchers. You can see this in very clearly in the letter of Jude, where they talk about these beings. Now, I think they I think that in that tradition, they viewed everything, almost everything, that the Watchers taught humans to be a product of evil, which is wrong. Teaching women to use cosmetics, that's not evil. Teaching people how to build amazing architectural monuments is not evil. Teaching, advancing our knowledge, advancing our scientific knowledge, advancing us mathematically and in many other ways is not evil. but they also mixed that in with a lot of things. They made us part of their internecine struggle and their political struggles, to the point where we became used politically as pawns to fulfill their whims and desires. And in some cases, they established, in order to consolidate and secure power over certain realms or territories on Earth, they created religions around themselves, right? So they established priesthoods, and they established kingships, and they established an entire cult of worship that in some cases involved even human sacrifice. So it's not about Yahweh bad, watchers good, right? That's one thing that I've learned doing this series, is it's not, okay, now that we've learned that Yahweh is bad, we must believe that everything he says is a lie. Well, no, because the watchers are doing some pretty dicey things too, right? We have to think of them. We have to think of all these beings in terms of how we see the powerful interacting humanly. These human power, these human figures, politicians and bankers, right? Globalist bankers, how they interact, and how militaries interact with each other on our own planet. They use us and manipulate us for less than virtuous ends to further their goals. And that's how we have to look at the pantheons. That's how we have to look at these deities. And there are deities that are good, that really want the best for us. But there was this particular group, the Watchers, that mixed a lot of the good with a lot of bad. And there was Yahweh who in some ways revealed a very stable law, but also it was quite oppressive at the same time. So in a way, the overall message of this video is to just show you how incredibly nuanced things are. That religions and politics and the occult and all these things, we separate ourselves off, and we have to do that. We have to define ourselves. We have to create boundaries. But these boundaries and these standards are all in different places. They're all over the place because they are designed to satisfy the vision of reality that the people who create them have. And some people are more healthy than other people. But all this stuff exists along a spectrum, okay? So the question is there a single occult tradition? Maybe there is one. Maybe it's just not on the internet. Maybe there's some individuals out there, there's a small group out there, or a family tradition that is embodying the left and right pillars in a way that is as close to the ideal as we can get. I wouldn't mind creating something like that. One may already exist, but it's just not popular, because typically balanced people are not very popular, because everyone by nature tends to be extreme. That's part of living in this dual existence, this manifested existence. We have to go through eons and eons of growth before we figure out how to do things, right? Okay, so so basically, I'm not putting forth a particular model. I don't think that the New Testament esoteric Kabbalistic model is the right one either, because even though in one sense it's more balanced in the sense that it's rejecting Yahweh and it's rejecting these watchers, some of the more extreme aspects of the watcher ideology, it is also just as harsh in a different way than the Yahweh cult. In the Yahweh cult, Yahweh was doing a lot of terrible things to his people and to other people, but they were temporal acts, right? he did a lot of killing, he did a lot of slaying, he was very jealous, he was very open about that. He starved his people. He burned part of the congregation with fire that shot out from him. He poisoned them. He sent poisonous vipers after them. He built an army. He used them to build an army so that they could kill more of his enemies. There were even instances of human sacrifice in the Old Testament, where in order to keep a vow, if you made a vow to kill the next thing, that like Jephthah did that came out of the woods, well, you had to keep your vow according to the book of Numbers. And there were other types of sacrifices as well, human sacrifice, that don't jump out at us as clearly because of the way the Old Testament was redacted. And I'm going to get into, like I said, I'm going to talk about that too in the future. But the New Testament shows us a model, gives us a Jesus who is far more docile, far more kind, far more merciful. He doesn't treat his people that way. He treats them the opposite. And he universalizes the principle of love, right? But then suddenly you get to the book of Revelation. And by the way, and I don't think the whole book of, I don't think that this Kabbalistic crowd that contributed to the New Testament is necessarily responsible for every book in the New Testament. I think there are actually multiple books, esoteric books in the New Testament, that may even be written by different groups who may have seen eye to eye in most ways, but not in every way, right? I don't think that the esoteric author of the book of Hebrews is necessarily belongs to the same group that wrote the book of Revelation. Maybe they did. With all its talk about Melchizedek in its Hermetic language about the tabernacle of Moses being a copy of this eternal temple in the heaven, not made with hands, this as above so below thing. So but regardless, even though some of these books may have been written by different people, because Christians read the New Testament as a whole, the overall picture they get of Christianity is one of great severity as it pertains to the afterlife, because Revelation has Jesus, basically, he has the key of death and Hades, and they have him basically tossing those who aren't written in his book of life into the lake of fire, they experience the second death. And depending on your perspective, it depends on how you interpret certain New Testament texts, they are either suffering temporarily, or it's a picture of being annihilated. It's a picture of annihilation, or it's an eternal experience. But most Christians believe it's an eternal experience. So which do you prefer? I don't really prefer either one of them. Neither one is a non-dual approach. Neither one expresses a non-dual ethos. So in that sense, Jesus is just as harsh, just as severe as the Yahweh we see in the Old Testament. So I don't want Yahweh. I don't want Jesus, although Jesus teaches us a lot of good things. And I don't want the Watchers necessarily, although I might be willing to work with certain ones if I can gain the upper hand, and I'm discerning about it, and I don't necessarily worship them or get too deeply involved with their machinations. If I am, but anyway, we don't have to get into all that. But the point is, reality is extremely nuanced, and there's a right pillar, a left pillar, and a middle pillar, and all these different systems that have come down to us through the traditional religions, not just the Abrahamic ones, but more of the esoteric ones, such as we see in the Far East, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on, as well as all the way down to these various cults who more or less wish to be anonymous or just more or less underground. All of these groups exist somewhere along this spectrum between the left pillar and the right pillar, because in non-duality we don't believe in a perfect system. We don't believe that truth is revealed in the sense of an infallible book comes down from heaven. And so that's not how we get our information. There isn't, therefore, a perfect system. That's why there are all these different systems of ethics and different practices certain esoterics are willing to engage in, or not, or they're not willing to engage in. Why they draw the line in certain areas and not in others. To me, that makes for a more fascinating, interesting, and worthwhile world. Things are much more organic. There's so much more mystery. There's a vastness to reality that is so much more than Christianity has to offer. There are endless worlds, galaxies, beings, creatures, some suffering more than others. Some are, occupying planets. Others are in the underworld. Others are on Earth. And we have to navigate all of this, and through experience figure out where we are on this trajectory, where we are on the scale of being, and how we want to define ourselves in terms of these three pillars. Okay, so that was like I told you, though. I told you that it was going to be lengthy. Wow, longer than I thought. Wow, a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. But I did say that I would try to interact with certain comments. If there were questions. I mean, there's way too many here, but I can go back through and look at them later and maybe do something separately on it if I can't get to them. There's a lot of hate that I'm seeing at the beginning, which I guess I have to kind of expect. Do you believe in evolution? I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with evolution anymore. But I understand it very, very differently as an esoteric, as a mystic. I'm not your run-of-the-mill naturalist. And in fact, there may be a sense in which we descended from there is a sense in which we descended from a higher plane to a lower. So in a sense, we can speak in terms of devolution. And in terms of biological evolution, that is predicated on spiritually evolving. So we become, and I do believe that evolution, therefore, because I believe in God, I believe evolution is directed. It's not just this kind of I shouldn't say random, because it's not really random in Darwinism. There's more nuance to it than that. So I don't want to mischaracterize it, but there is an intelligence, let's say, behind it. And I believe that there are archetypes in God that when we come into union with God, we come into union with the perfect archetype of our being that existed in the mind of God from the beginning. And so our experience is bringing us to that point. And that is why, for those who want to know whether we can fall again, can we fall repeatedly? No, we can't, because when we were first created, we were created without experience. We were created without knowledge. We were created in a state of innocence, in that sense, not knowledge. And once we acquire that knowledge, not just theoretical knowledge, but knowledge through experience, and we have integrated all of that, and acquired union with God to the point where we have broken free of the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, there will not be a repeat in the individual experience. There will not be a repeat of that. Adam and Eve didn't start out as monkeys. I don't know why everybody thinks, I didn't really spend a lot of time talking about that subject of evolution, so I don't know why everybody is on that jag, but I will say, well, again, I have a nuanced view on that too. If we believe the narrative as taught in these ancient Sumerian texts, it was a combination of evolving from primitive hominids as well as we were created by these these more powerful entities, the Anunnaki. They used their DNA and they mixed it with the DNA of more primitive, maybe bipedal beings who may have been more human than we think, but they were just more primitive than we are. Or they may have been apes, but either way, we are intelligent because we get our DNA, I think, from the Anunnaki. I am from India. Good to see you. I've gleaned a lot of valuable information from Hinduism. Why would anyone want esoteric Christianity? Well, just go back through and listen to this video and listen to some of my other videos, and you'll see why. Well, I don't know if you're a Christian or not, and so it's kind of hard to answer that, not knowing whether you're a Christian or not. But I would say, I guess for some people it's comforting, because you're on familiar ground. You came out of Christianity, so why not stay in it and just embrace a more esoteric form of it? I find that to the extent that there are perennialist thinkers operating within the fold, it can be an uplifting experience. I just don't find that perspective is represented very well, or it's not represented by there aren't very many people that in it, that are offering that perspective. And also too, as I've been saying, this esoteric first century Christianity is dualistic as well. It's just in a different way than Yahweh theology was. And I just don't find dualism to be satisfying at any level whatsoever. There's too much room for abuse ethically, and in terms of trying to impose your way, your belief system on other people, particularly at the point of violence. So there's a lot of temptation in that regard. But also just in terms of the eschatology, and in terms of the metaphysics, and in terms of the philosophy, it's not coherent to be a dualist. And so I've rejected Christianity, even esoteric Christianity, for that reason. And it's for the same reason that I reject other esoteric schools of thought that have embraced dualism. I just don't find them in any way satisfying or coherent. What else do we have here? I see a lot of comments. I don't really see too many questions. Do you think? Do I think Baal is a real being? Well, I mean, to the extent that he plays a prominent role in the theogony of ancient Sumeria, and ancient Sumeria, and his cult is preserved, and he's brought into other subsequent pantheons, and is seems to respond to his devotees historically. I think he was able to do certain things for his community that you see occultists today getting from some of their own interactions with certain beings that they are evoking and invoking. So I think in that sense he is certainly a reality. There's a huge spectrum of thought in terms of whether these beings are persons per se, or whether they are purely archetypal, or whether they are just energetic qualities. Some hold to a mixture of all three, which I think may be closer to the truth. which is why I have kind of presented them that way in this talk. Okay. All right, I will let you guys go. This has gone on for about 85 minutes. So thanks for sticking around, some of you few intrepid ones who did. And then most of you probably won't see this until I've recorded it, or until I posted it. So have a great weekend, and I will be getting back to my series on Yahweh very soon.